So why did you just all eat? Why did you just fuel your bodies? That's my question. In other words, if you've got an empty gas tank in your car, you don't fill it up unless you want to go somewhere, I would presume. So did you eat in order to get rich, for the pleasure of eating? You know, Leonardo da Vinci, he said that most people go through life as mere passages for food. That's how they spend their entire lives. And the question then is, why are we feeding our bodies? Is it to make money, to get rich? A wise man once said, "Choose a noble goal and make ye a mighty effort." But many people today don't think the world is too noble, or even that humanity is noble. Many people today think we're animals that have to fulfill every instinct, every desire. Perhaps even more, think technologically that we're machines or computers that have a code. So the notion of having a noble goal presupposes that we have a sense of nobility. And even so-called religious people often have selfish goals to get into heaven or to get into paradise. However, we have to look to science then to get our answer as to why we should feed our bodies. Why should we be alive? What is the purpose of being here? And the sun, which is the source of all light and life on this planet, is the law of the universe. And it gives us the example of what we should emulate. Did you know that every second, the sun expends 400 million tons of itself, every second, to give light to Earth, to give life to Earth. Every second, 400 million tons of itself disappear. So imagine how big the sun is. So the sun, which is the center of our universe, gives us the law of the universe, and that law is creative death, that's our purpose. Generative sacrifice, that we creatively sacrifice, that's the purpose of being alive, not to hoard possessions, okay? And so I think Martin Luther King Jr. agreed when he said, "Until you found something worth dying for, you haven't found a reason to live." So he was in agreement with this notion of creative death being the purpose of life, not comfort, not longevity. So how can we imitate the sun? How do we know the sun, really? We really know it through its rays. In fact, if you go to the beach, you probably would tell someone, "I was lying in the sun." But you weren't. You were lying in its rays. But the rays and the sun are so identified with each other that we say, I was lying in the sun, when in fact you were lying in the rays, because we really can't know the sun. If we were to attempt to go to the sun, we would cease to be. And by the same token, if the sun descended to planet Earth would cease to be. And so it sends its rays, and that's how we know it, and they're identified with the sun itself, of course. So historically, many civilizations, I can think of two at the moment, the Inca and the ancient Egyptians, they used the sun as a metaphor for the first cause, for the prime mover of the universe, the creative force that people call God. And we might have been taught in school because of prejudices that they worshiped the sun, and they didn't worship the sun any more than Christians worship the cross. But the sun and the cross were symbols of this generative sacrifice. That's the law of the universe. And so the Sun King, so to speak, the unknowable essence we call God, sends us human rays, divine manifestations of that essence, historically and intermittently through history. They've been sent to guide us. And we know many of their names: Abraham, Moses, Krishna, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Zoroaster. These are just some of the names that we know, and of course, there are many that we don't know, and that, recorded history, that existed before recorded history. But my point is that humanity has never been without guidance as to how to live and why we should eat. Okay? It's always received these manifestations of the sun, of the unknowable essence that gives all light and life to planet Earth. And so, if you put the first image up, Mateen, a similar analogy is in school. The education process is one, but you have many grades, and you get a different teacher with a new textbook. But every teacher builds on what the previous teacher taught and prepares you for the next. And if you're in the 12th grade, the 4th grade textbook doesn't work for you anymore. So this is why historically the guidance has adjusted. Now, only the followers of religions claim exclusivity for their messenger. Do you understand what I mean? The messengers themselves never claim that they were the only one, because they talk about, Jesus said, before Moses was, I am. And he talked about how the Spirit of truth would eventually come and lead us into all knowledge. And all of these manifestations of God made those similar past and future references. It's only the blinded followers who claim exclusivity, the possessiveness of human nature. Believe that as it may, let me give a more folksy analogy. As a parent, if you were to move to a new town, one of the first things you would do if you had young children is you'd search for who's a good pediatrician in case your child gets sick. And so you would do an investigation. You'd do a search. You wouldn't just believe if someone told you that someone was. You'd want to find out for yourself and do a search. Now, after you've done this search, let's say a day comes when your child gets sick, very sick, and so you go to this pediatrician, who you've recognized to be the best one in town. And this doctor says, okay, you've got to give this medicine to the child. It's going to taste terrible. It'll probably keep her up all night, and she might cry, but it'll get her better. Now, at that point, as a parent, if you said, oh, I don't want my child to be uncomfortable, I really don't want her to have a stomach ache, so I'll go find another solution to this illness, we would think that parent is quite ignorant, because he or she has already made the search for the best physician. So the same thing has to be done historically, that we do an independent investigation of the divine physician for the age in which we live. Because as we pointed out before, even though they all give the same spiritual teachings, encouraging us to pray and not to steal, to love your neighbor, the social teachings for society are different because the problems of society are different from every age. So we need the new messenger for the age in which we live in order, let's say for today, to deal with the worldwide problems that the messengers of the past did not address. So in fact, no one can be born a Christian or a Jew or a Baha'i. You can be born into the culture of Christianity, of Judaism and Baha'i, but until the individual, he or she himself, makes an independent investigation of who Jesus, Moses, Muhammad, etc. are, mere belief is not enough. I mean, there's a lot of people believe that the world is flat, so belief is insufficient. It's not scientific. And there is no discrepancy, ultimately. Or I should say there's a harmony between true religion and science. So true religion is a practice. It's not a tradition. It's the practice of the presence of God. It's the practice of the invisible world, of the eternal. So this is how we know the meaning of life, by investigating who is the divine physician for the age in which we live, who has the healing medicine, the prescription of living. And what results from that, the title of this talk, is a contract. There is this, and a contract always involves two parties, correct? And so if humanity follows the guidance of the divine physician for the age in which you live, civilization will advance and each individual will realize his or her highest potential. That's the contract. And if you read the Torah, the Jewish Torah, the Old Testament, it's a chronicle of what happens to a people when they obey that contract and when they disobey it. So it's a fascinating study, and I urge us all who might not be familiar with it, to see that, because it's an incredible document, the Torah, of this notion of obedience. And it's not blind obedience, because you've done the scientific investigation. It's conscious knowledge that this is the best physician, so to speak. So therefore, I would contend that the noblest goal we can have is to keep our end of the contract, and that we have with the universe. And so we have to know what those laws of the universe are. We have to do this independent investigation, and then the recognition, like the parent would do who moved and looked for a pediatrician. But then, unlike that example of a parent, you would then obey the guidance. And once again, I refer you to the Old Testament, to the Torah, that gives this whole story of what happens when you obey and when you don't. So all of that is the greater covenant. The greater covenant that, in a sense, you could say, in summary, it's a contract with the manifestation or messenger of God for the age in which you live, and that it has existed throughout recorded history, or even before recorded history, because we know about Abraham, and at least as far back as Abraham. So now let me address what the lesser covenant is, if I could. Each one of these teachers, messengers, it's like an outpouring of rain on earth, making everything grow and green. And after the passing of these various messengers, they leave a reservoir of that water in their writings. So we have the Gospels, we have the Quran, we have the Torah. There's still some of that life-giving water to guide the followers of these messengers. Now, the problem that's happened historically is that each one of these messengers has appointed an interpreter after their passing to interpret the writings. So we know for a fact, according to the Gospels, that Jesus appointed Peter. It's just one reference to it, so it's not as if it were a will and testament. We know that Muhammad appointed Ali, but really after the passing or the ascension, or really the resurrection of these teachings in each case, the Christians turned to Paul rather than Peter for the most part, and the Muslims turned to Abu Bakr rather than Ali. And so history has the result of that. The division between Sunni and Shiite, between Protestant and Catholic, and all these divisions and schisms that were created because of not holding to the lesser covenant. So what is the lesser covenant? It's each one of these messengers gives a covenant with the followers as to where to turn after their passing, so that the bread of life, the creative word, doesn't get polluted. In fact, to continue that reservoir analogy, you can think of it if there isn't a protective enclosure around the reservoir, then anyone can, there's free access to it, and people can begin to bathe in it and wash their clothes in it. And this is essentially what happened, that everyone decided to interpret these for themselves, and then in some cases, because of ego or for whatever reason, they wanted to force their interpretation upon other people. And so all these different denominations and schisms resulted in these religions, causing disunity, contradicting the word religion, which comes from the Latin meaning to link or to unite. As Muhammad said, the truth is one. The ignorant have made it many. So what's different about today? In this age of maturity, in which we no longer need a priesthood, in the past, the priesthood, the rabbis, the mullahs were very important because most people were illiterate. And so they were the ones who had access to the scripture. But one of the signs of this age of maturity is that we're not dependent upon anyone else's interpretation anymore. That each person has to independently investigate. And another sign of the maturity is that, we're not even sure who wrote the Torah. We know 4 people wrote the Gospels, but they wrote them 40 to 90 years after the passing of Jesus. And we know what happens with time and memory. And so it's a little bit more, you could say, authentic or trustworthy. And then the Quran was the actual written words of Muhammad, but they weren't compiled until 4 years after his passing. And we know about this arguing that went on right over his deathbed. So we can imagine what might have happened. So my point being is that there's always been questions then about the total authenticity. In this day and age, the scripture of Baha'u'llah is in his own hand. And rather than simply leaving a reservoir of his teachings, he's left an ocean. Some 400 volumes, some 400 Qurans, some 400 Bibles, if you will. Most importantly, in terms of the Lesser Covenant, he sealed off his revelation from intruders who might want to pollute it for their own purposes. And he did this by clearly appointing who was the bona fide interpreter of his writings. The second image, Martine. So in the case of the Baha'i faith, he appointed Abdul-Baha. And I'll leave it to your personal investigation as to see how this lesser covenant continued in the Baha'i faith. Which isn't to say in the last 150 years there's been plenty of attempts at schisms, even within the family of Baha'u'llah. All right? But what happens in this day of maturity and this day of in which the covenant is not going to be broken for the first time, is that these schisms are like a branch of a tree that breaks off, and for a while it looks like it's flourishing, but then eventually it turns brown and it rots. And so all these schisms in this day have not been able to withstand the power of this age of maturity with the covenant. And so to return to the notion of generative sacrifice, the law of the universe, that the sun shows us, creative death, is what we should be emulating. And that leads us, of course, for the historians in the room, to understand why the first 20,000 who gave their life for the Baha'i faith are called dawn breakers. Okay, because they were breaking the new day, you see. They were doing that creative, they were imitating the sun. So that's what we're eating for. Those of you who go to work or go to study, the thing about human beings is, unlike any other creature, that we can sacrifice now for later. We can postpone immediate gratification for the future. So you're earning at a job, but you get paid later. At school, you're studying, but the fruits of that curriculum are also in the future. There are many things human beings do about investing in the future through this postponing of gratification. And so we see, in the example I gave before of mothers, who, perhaps many of you would rather at 3 a.m. be raving or clubbing, but a mother would rather get out of a warm bed to go help a baby who might be crying at 3 a.m. So we already see that it's humanly possible for someone to live for others, to live sacrificially. And to go back to the Bible for a second, the second major story in the Bible after Adam and Eve is the story of their 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that story, so I'll just briefly refer to it. But you know that the 2 brothers gave sacrifices. Abel was a shepherd, and Cain was a farmer, for lack of a better term, let's say. He tilled the field. And they each gave sacrifices to God. Abel sacrificed a lamb, and Cain sacrificed some crops. Cain's sacrifice wasn't accepted by the Lord. And it's a very short verse in the Torah about this, but it's a very profound couple of sentences. And we learn that God basically informs Cain that he'd only be acceptable, or his offering would only be acceptable, if it was an exceptional offering that life demands of us. And Cain's response is not to improve, but resentment. So we see here that human drama that happens, okay, where we get resentful of God for not accepting our prayers or our sacrifice. And he rejects the opportunity, Cain, to give his all and to offer his best, and instead he kills Abel out of his resentment. And of course, we see this archetypal story running down through movies and myths, you know, whether it's The Lion King about the two brothers or Hamlet, you know. So this notion of this division between brothers. And the question becomes for us, though, when we read these myth stories, is what should your sacrifice or offering be? And these stories dramatically warn us that it better be the best you have. And so the work that most redeems existence, you know, why we all just had a meal, and why we eat, the work that redeems existence is the complete sacrifice of our all for that which is highest. Not sacrificing it to be an influencer or to be the richest person in the neighborhood, but the complete sacrifice of our all for that which is highest. So now let me go back for the last part of this talk to history. And let's take the next image, please, Mateen. Let's go back to Abraham and the son. It's one thing to sacrifice yourself and be willing to sacrifice your time tonight to be here and the effort to be here. It could be somewhere else. It's one thing to sacrifice your life for someone else. But to be able to sacrifice your child? The first story of the three most widespread religions in the Western world, the source story of Judaism, of Christianity and Islam, is the intended sacrifice of Abraham of his son, because he was commanded to do so by God. Now, to give you the backstory, if you don't recall it, Abraham and Sarah, his wife, they couldn't have children. And according to the Bible, they're like in their 70s and they still haven't had children. And because Abraham begins teaching that there's only one God in a place that was polytheistic, God promises him, you know, that he will have a child. And so Sarah gives birth. The child begins to grow up. And as you know the story, then one day, for whatever reason, if we can ever know all the reasons, the mysteries of the universe, the voice of God, so to speak, tells him to sacrifice his only son. And because Abraham is Abraham, he's going to obey. But then what happens because he's willing to obey? According to the story, an angel intervenes. Or, you know, think of it as the still small voice within, or your conscience, whatever. You know, don't get lost in the artist's imagery, so to speak. But an angel appears and shows him a ram that can be sacrificed instead. And the voice tells him, because of his complete willingness to surrender his preferences and his will and his son to God without understanding why, he not only will have this son, but his descendants will be more numerous than the stars in the sky. And followers of Christianity, of Zoroastrianism, of Islam, of Judaism, of Baha'i, can all trace their ancestry back to Abraham through one of his wives, which is pretty astounding. So this is something to meditate on, you know, this story, because it can't be logically understood, the notion of sacrificing a child. And yet, let's look at the next image, Mateen. If you know the story of Moses, you know, the Jews were enslaved in Egypt. And Pharaoh begins to get nervous because the Jewish community is getting pretty big. So he decrees that all the newborn Jewish boys are to be murdered. So Moses' Jewish mother puts him in a cradle and pushes him off into the Nile. Welcome, Tim. Nice to have you. Pushes him into the Nile, hoping and praying that someone kind will find her son. Okay? Now, what's interesting to me is the Hebrew word in the Torah for this cradle is the same word that's used for ark in the story of Noah. So it's given to us to meditate on, do we save humanity in a sense? Is the ark of humanity? Can we only save our child if we give him or her to the world? It's something to meditate on, because all of these stories bring us back to this Now, providentially, who finds the baby? The daughter of Pharaoh. And Moses is raised in Pharaoh's home, and then therefore he's in a position to argue with Pharaoh and to say, let my people go when the time comes. All right? So once again, in the wisdom of the all-knowing, all right, but this Jewish mother, she sacrifices her son. Now the next image, which you're all familiar with, of course, is the sacrifice matine of the next one, is when you walk into St. Peter's Basilica, the first thing you see is Michelangelo's sculpture of the Pieta. So here we have Mary cradling her dead son, who she sacrificed. It's pretty profound. So it's something to meditate on. We're willing to sacrifice our all, but suppose can we go beyond that even? Or is it only the manifestations of God that can do this? Because as you see in the next image, Baha'u'llah also sacrificed his son. This is Mirza Mehdi, the younger brother of Abdul-Baha, whose image you saw earlier. And as you know the story, he fell through the skylight of the prison in Israel, in Akka. And as he lay bleeding, and everyone was just horror-struck by the accident, Baha'u'llah asked his son what he wanted, and he said, because of course Baha'u'llah could have healed him, just like Jesus was known to have raised the dead, or we know all these stories. And what his son says, his 21-year-old son, he says, please accept my death as a sacrifice so that all the people that have been trying to see you and come to Israel on pilgrimage, who haven't been able to, can come to see you. And Baha'u'llah accepts this offering, and his son then passes away. So if any of you have been on pilgrimage, it's due to this sacrifice. So I'm mentioning all this because, once again, this notion, is it true that you could only save your child if you give him or her to the world, the way these manifestations of God did, as opposed to hoarding wealth and possessions? Maybe we can hang on to our children forever. So maybe this is an example. And then the final image on this theme I'll show you is the famous poet of the 19th century in Iran named Tahereh. One of the greatest women of the 19th century, a lot of people don't even know about. The first woman to proclaim the emancipation of women. She did it 2 weeks before the Seneca Falls Conference in upstate New York, which a lot of people thought was the first time the equality of men and women was proclaimed. She did it by taking off her veil in Iran, where it was unheard of to see a woman's face in public. So we tend to hear the story of Tahereh in terms of her removing of the veil. But in order to do what she did, to save humanity, to serve, she had to never see her children again. So in summary, what I'd like to do is show the next image, which is a quote. So in summary, let's say you've done your investigation and you've recognized the messenger for the age in which you live. Then according to this quote by Abdul-Baha, he says, from amongst all mankind, He hath chosen you, and your eyes have been opened to the light of guidance, and your ears attuned to the music of the company on high. And your hearts and souls have been born into new life. Thank ye and praise ye God. To thank him for this, make ye a mighty effort and choose for yourselves a noble goal. Through the power of faith, obey ye the teachings, the covenant, the contract, the teachings of God, and let all your actions conform to his laws. So this is how we're called upon in the face of life's overwhelming difficulties and its opportunities, in the face of these, to offer no less than absolutely everything we have. Psychologically offering even more than we do materially. Namely, to offer our will. The only prayer we have by Jesus the night before he was crucified. He asked that the suffering not happen on the following day on the cross. But how did he conclude his prayer? He said, but not my will, but thy will be done. So the most we can offer perhaps to God is our will. And this is how we remain firm in the covenant. And let's conclude then with the words of Baha'u'llah regarding this theme on the next image, please, Mateen. Baha'u'llah says, O thou who hast surrendered thy will to God, by self-surrender and perpetual union with God is meant that men should merge their will wholly in the will of God and regard their desires as utter nothingness beside his purpose. Whatsoever the Creator hath commanded his creatures to observe, the same must they diligently and with the utmost joy and eagerness arise and fulfill. They should in no wise allow their fancy to obscure their judgment. Neither should they regard their own imaginings as the voice of the eternal. So humanity's contract with the universe is twofold, just to sum up, right? To do the scientific investigation. Forget about belief. You can't be born into faith. You've got to go on your scientific search of independently investigating. And then recognize the divine physician, like that woman did searching for the pediatrician. But then once you recognize, once again, unlike that mother or father, might have been a father, we're going to obey the prescription for living that the divine physician gives us. And even if we don't understand it, we can remember Abraham, who didn't understand why he should kill his son. Even if we don't understand it, we obey. And it's not blind obedience and it's not blind faith. It's conscious knowledge because you've done the scientific, independent investigation of truth. So that's the challenge of tonight's talk. And that if we can keep this contract with the universe, then not only will we find our highest potential as individuals, but will advance civilization and society, which right now is suffering on the sickbed as false physicians prescribe it, false remedies, will finally be healed. So thank you very much. Where's Andrew? Andrew, do you want to play again?
Do we have any, questions?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Do we have any questions at the mic?
Or answers.
Okay. Or statements? It doesn't have to be like,
It could be about anything it's on your heart, yeah.
It could be any questions people have, if it's your first time hearing about the faith or, just, yeah.
In the story of Cain and Abel, his sacrifice wasn't worthy. If I know there's a story in the Bible, a poor beggar gives her last 2 cents at a synagogue, and that's seen as a greater gift than all of the rich people giving from their deep coffers very little
Right.
gold. If Cain had given,
Is it on?
yeah, if he'd given more of a significant amount, if he gave something that would really affect him and be meaningful, would that have been sufficient, or was it just what he was sacrificing wasn't worthy to God?
So you're referring to the story of what's called the widow's mite, M-I-T-E, which is a coin. And because everyone else is showing how much money they're giving, you know, Jesus points to her. You know, she gives like her last penny. And so he says, this is great. Now, the mistake we can make as materialistic Americans is to think only in terms of quantity and material, you know. So it wasn't really, you know, just as when we give to the fund, it's not just about the quantity, but it's the level of sacrifice that she was doing, you see. And so in terms of Cain, and once again, the passage is only a few sentences long in the Torah. But I think my understanding of the implication is that there's something attitudinal going on with Cain, that he's not giving his all, you know. So I don't think it's about necessarily the amount or the quality, you know. It's got something to do with psychologically giving your all. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
more so about the attitude.
I think so, yes. And part of that attitude can be, you know, to make sure that you're not looking to get paid back because you're doing something for God, so to speak. You know what I mean? So there's all different ways in which you can have impure motives when you do something like that. You know. So we don't really know, but resentment is a big part of it. We see how he then reacts. You know, but it's the scariest story to be right there in the beginning of the Bible. You know.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for the talk. It was really enlightening. But I just had a very quick question. Something small that you mentioned, but it was regarding Jesus appointing Peter,
Yeah.
but then people started following Paul. To my understanding, Abdu'l-Baha claimed that Paul was also like one of the greatest friends of Christianity. But was there a power struggle necessarily between Peter and Paul?
There was actually there was another apostle that was said to be the brother of Jesus named James, who the Christians in Jerusalem started following. There wasn't a power struggle between Peter and Paul. It wasn't a personal kind of a thing. And you're absolutely right. Abdu'l-Baha has words of praise of Paul, but as a teacher of Christianity, you see, because he spread the faith all through the Mediterranean. But Abdu'l-Baha also makes mention about Peter being the one who Jesus had indicated was the interpreter. And, you know, once again, it's just a brief passage where he says, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," you know, and you know, what that's been interpreted as meaning that Peter was. Paul never even knew Jesus. He never met him. He became a Christian after the ascension of Jesus, you know. But he was this great teacher of Christianity. In fact, he was killing Christians. He was a very Orthodox Jew, and he was putting Christians to death when he had his famous road to Damascus epiphany and was knocked off his horse by a vision, and then he became a Christian, you know. So I don't know if I'm answering your question or not.
I see. So it was so Jesus, similarly to how Muhammad appointed Ali ibn Abi Talib to be the leader, he appointed Paul or Peter. But then Paul, after receiving his vision, becoming a Christian, he became a teacher.
Yes, a great, you know, he really traveled all over. And, you know, you probably know better than I do, but the percentage of the New Testament that's actually written by Paul is probably at least 50%. And 9 times out of 10, when you're talking to Christians, they quote Paul, not Jesus. You know, so that shows you the power I'm not saying that he sought that power, but that influence, that so yeah, so not to take anything away from him as a great teacher of Christianity, as a wonderful man, but that whole notion of who is really the interpreter, you know.
Okay, sorry, I have a very quick
Yeah.
follow-up question. Because I know that Paul had a lot of, he wrote some interpretive rules on the law regarding the new covenant. Like he said kosher is to be abrogated, right? I believe in Galatians, he said like another angel, like it doesn't matter who brings the gospel, you follow this one. Would you say that some of the rules, such as women covering their head and Corinthians and all that, these are inventions, or do you think it would be within line of?
Well, you make a good point. One of the other things Paul wanted to do as a former Jew is he wanted all the new Christians to be circumcised. And that was another split then in Christianity. That no, they're not Jewish, So you make a good point that he, and this is my personal opinion as to why he's quoted more often than Jesus, because often his writings are more black and white. Jesus is a mystical that you've got to meditate on, a little bit more. And so there are these social rules, like it's better to marry than to burn, he says. In other words, it's a terrible, So these notions about things about sexuality and sex, they come from Paul as well, and so you're right. I think those are the things that get quoted, and yet.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have any? Yes, Roger.
I'm by no means a biblical scholar, but I have been aware over the last period of my life about the questions about Christianity and the hiding of well, I don't know if hiding is the right word, but of the Ethiopian Bible, which has 88 books, as opposed to, the King James Version, which was written much later. And the King James Version doesn't seem to match up with, the current science that we're uncovering about, genetics, where man or humanity originated, and I'm coming upon evidence of black deities in Russia and Iran and so forth that were hidden over time. And that seems to match up more if life did indeed start in Africa. And I really struggle when I see the whiteness of the King James Version. So I don't know. I guess I'm just looking for comments, insight.
Not only the whiteness, but the maleness. They leave out the Gospel of Mary Magdalene as well, So if anyone else has any response to that, we're happy to hear it. But.
Well, from what I understand, from a former colleague of mine, that up until the Renaissance, Europe fully acknowledged its debt to Africa. But it started to change just during the Renaissance, so it wasn't that long ago. So I don't know, any comments that you have?
Go ahead,
Jim.
He'll bring you the
How
mic.
you doing, Tim?
While Bettine's bringing the mic, just, of course, the Queen of Sheba who visited Solomon in 1000 BC, Right.
So I'll comment a little bit less about the Bible, but more about Europe and things left out of European history. For example, the Moors of Northwest Africa, who were Muslim, African, black Africans, they took Europe out of the Dark Ages. African society had advanced civilization. For example, before the Moors made their way into Spain, folks were throwing their trash outside the front door of their houses. There was no sanitation. There was no real irrigation. There was no understanding about how to light lamps in the streets. All of these technological advances, these are just a few examples I'm giving, were coming from advanced society of the Moors. They ruled in Europe, particularly in Spain, for 700 years, until the year 1492. So up until 1492, they ruled. And the Spanish did everything they could, for example, to erase the history of African influence in Spain. So you will not find much of this in any Eurocentric history books or textbooks. So the reason that you see the versions of the Bible that are so Eurocentric in nature, including the pictures of Christ and all these other pictures, is they wanted to erase any remote sign of African in history, period. So whether it be in Christian texts, whether it be in other texts that are more secular. So that's why this Bible you're referencing, the Ethiopian Bible, is a little bit more accurate. And by the way, King James was just ripping out whatever pages he thought didn't make sense in the Bible. So that version of the Bible has a lot of the gospel missing. Also, there's a whole lot of gospel missing in other texts. Understand this, there is somewhere between 19 and 27,000 sects of Christianity that have existed in this world, in this history. So that makes sense that there's some things that have changed, that are missing. So what would be better to focus on is if a divine teacher shared something about Christ or the text, that's something more likely to be focused on, because whatever they say is coming directly from the voice of God. So if Baha'u'llah, for example, shares something, that is coming directly as the voice of God, sharing about the text. And by the way, as someone who grew up Christian, in the New Testament, the Old Testament is just the Torah, by the way, but in the New Testament, at least from the perspective of many of the Christian churches in the United States, the teachings of the Apostle Paul is what most folks go off of in terms of how to live as a Christian. So I don't know if that was shared earlier. I came in here a little late.
Any other questions?
Hello, I'm Kenzie. This is my first time here, and honestly, I had never even heard of Baha'i up until recently. I'm Persian, but very, uneducated on a lot of the culture, and I feel like this is probably a very, big part of Persian culture, despite it being, relatively, new in a sense. And I was just very curious, because I know nothing about this. I was curious, what are the key differences?
What are the what?
Key differences between, like being Baha'i or being, like Christian or Muslim or Jewish, because I know that, those are like the big three. That like they kind of build on top of each other, and I'm kind of getting the vibe that this is also one of those, that it's like built on top of those. And I just wanted to know what is, like, what's the difference?
That's a good question. I would say the essential difference, which I alluded to earlier, is that they all have given the same spiritual teaching, so to speak. So if you wanted to be a good Jew or a good Christian or a good Buddhist following the spiritual teachings, you could very well know your higher self, so to speak, you know what I mean? But the second kind of teachings that each one of these messages bring are the social teachings to help the problems of society at the time in which they come. So Moses might say, don't eat pork. Well, if you're wandering in the desert for 40 years, it's a good idea not to eat pork. And we know, of course, that Muhammad said the same thing. It was another desert culture, okay? But Christians were eating pork. Moses said you could get divorced. Jesus said you can't get divorced. So social teachings, often that have to do with diet or marriage, they change. And unfortunately, we foolish humans look at those differences in the social teachings and say, okay, we can't agree, you know? But if we understood that, you know, maybe now if somebody wanted to eat pork, it's fine. Abraham says, circumcise your males. Well, it was actually a scientific principle, just like not eating pork in a desert, because people didn't bathe back then, and infection was very, you know, maybe now it's not necessary, but people will still argue over these social teachings. So I became a Baha'i when I was 22, after being an atheist for 3 years. I was raised Catholic, 12 years of Catholic school. But it was because I recognized that Baha'u'llah was bringing the planet together, that his teachings were fulfilling the prophecies of all these religions, but also that he had the solution, the social solutions for the economic problems of the world right now, for example, for the racial problems for the world right now. And so it's those, if you're only interested in enlightenment or being saved or being a chosen person, then maybe the spiritual teachings are enough for you. But if you care about society and humanity, you want to know what the social teachings are so that you can help. So a Baha'i, in a sense, has that subjective faith, but it has to be complemented with cooperative action in terms of serving society, not just trying to get into heaven or paradise. Does that help to answer a little bit?
Yeah, so it's more of what you can do for like others in society more than, I guess, you know, doing good for yourself, right? Is that what you're saying? Or?
Well, it's both in a sense, because once you have this recognition of the divine physician, so to speak, for the age in which you live, the medicine, so to speak, the teachings are going to help you to realize your true self, but they're also going to give you the ability to serve humanity in a way that's going to help it to advance as well. So it's a dual process. Now, just in terms of Persia, you know, we're not often taught this, once again, in the history books, but who was it that freed the Jews from their Babylonian captivity? It was Cyrus the Great from Persia. And why was his empire great? Because of the teachings of Zoroaster. And Christians aren't even told that the 3 wise men who show up to visit baby Jesus, they're called 3 magi, because magi was the Persian word for a scientist priest. So these were 3 Zoroastrians coming who recognized the Christ child. But my point in mentioning Cyrus the Great is, in terms of Judaism, when he freed the Jews from so this great culture of Persia, came from Zoroaster from back then. When Cyrus freed the Jews from the Babylonian captivity, he gave them 2 choices. He said, you can come back, you can come to Persia with us, and you can practice your religion. And 2 of them have books in the Bible. Daniel and Esther came back to Persia. Daniel became a prime minister, even though he was Jewish. Esther became married to the king. He said, if you don't want to come to Persia, I'll rebuild your temple in Jerusalem for you. So that Western Wall that's standing today was built by a Persian. And the Jews were so grateful. And even though Jews, like Muslims, shy away from iconography, you know, human depictions, they carved a tribute to Cyrus on one of the doors of the Jewish temple because of what he had done. So I'm mentioning this not just to show the great history of Persia, but to show how there's this intermingling that history books who wanted to push one agenda, you know, haven't showed us that these religions really are interconnected.
Wow, yeah, thank you so much. I didn't know any of that. So.
If I can add one thing, something that like is really interesting to me is you sort of talk about this interconnectedness, you know, like, and this is really on the basis level, but my understanding is like, Jesus came and every manifestation of God came to teach the world and to sort of guide the people towards a new light. It doesn't mean the previous religions didn't, their teachings doesn't matter, but especially today, we're living in a world of technology with planes, with ways we can travel around the country. We can go to Europe in less than like 10 hours, where honestly, like hundreds of years ago, you're going to get on a boat and you're not going to get there because you might be killed off from an illness. So there's so much interconnectedness. We can look at like Christianity, where Jesus came and said, "Love thy neighbor," because they were not loving each other. There were so many tribes and so many different types of arguments and opinions that it didn't last very long. People couldn't see each other from eye to eye. And then Muhammad came and he said, "Love thy country, love thy nation." And you can see it sort of building on that. And then Allah comes around and he says, "Love thy world." It doesn't mean don't love your neighbor. It doesn't mean don't love your nation. But it means love everyone around you. We don't know, maybe the next manifestation of God, next prophet may come and say, love the universe, because we may do space travel. Who knows? So everything's building on each other. Any other questions?
This question made me think of something, and it's something that I first saw from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was being interviewed one day, and he said one of his saddest days of the week is Sunday. I said, "Dr. King, you're a Baptist minister. Why would Sunday be one of your saddest days of the week?" He said, "Because on Sundays, somewhere between 9 a.m. and 1 p.m., it is the most segregated space on the entire earth. We got black churches and white churches and Asian churches, so on and so forth. So it's one of my saddest days, because here I am teaching and preaching about integration, and we're so segregated in my own religious tradition." I've thought about that over the years, and I remember when I was involved in youth ministry as a Christian, I looked out in the audience and I'm like, there's no diversity in this room right now. I don't like this. And I remember praying and saying, "God, there must be a way for there to be a more diverse pathway in terms of serving you, in terms of loving you, in terms of being closer to you." I had not read anywhere that heaven is this place of segregation. The whites over here, the Asians over here, Persians over here, so on and so forth, whatever it may be, right? I'd never read that. And then one day, somebody introduced me to this faith, the Baha'i faith. And I walked in a room, and I saw people from all different kinds of backgrounds. So I decided to stay for a while. And then I kept coming back, and they were consistent. And the main thing they kept talking about is service. Service to God, service to humanity, service to their community, and how they could be about service. I had never heard anything like this before. And then I realized they were doing it in a systematic way. And then I said, wait a minute. Dr. King was trying to do this with the civil rights movement. He had some success bringing people from different religious traditions, different faith backgrounds in terms of diversity. But this is all in this one faith. And the central point of this faith, the next thing I found, I read a quote. It said, "The true essence of faith is the fewness of words and the abundance of deeds. That is at the heart of the Baha'i faith." I said, what is this religion? I must learn more. And I haven't left since. It was 18 years ago.
We'll do like a few remaining one or two questions, and then Tom is around after as well, for at least for a few minutes.
In honor to Roger's points before, I would just like to cite the reference in the Baha'i faith regarding the black and the white races, in which he said that just as it's through the black of the eye that light enters, that through the black race, the light is entering this nation as well.
Sure. He has one more question.
I just have a question, either for you or for Tim, anybody else. But what about the lost tribes of Israel? Because I've been, I've been seeing a lot of, coming across a lot of information that they were actually black tribes. They still exist and they line up with prophecy. I just want to throw that out.
I myself can't speak to that at all, sorry.
Tim, you seem like you know the answer.
So eager.
I don't have the answer, but I think these lost tribes of Israel is the very centering point that groups such as the Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple, sort of base their religious traditions off of, the saying that black people of African descent are of the lost tribes of Israel. So I think that those sects of Islam that were created in America, in fact, there's a talk called Indigenous Islam in America, and it actually talks about that. I'll talk to you offline because I don't want to hijack any more of Tom's time here, but we can talk. We can dig deep. Roger and I are friends, so we can dig deep.
Yeah.
Any last question? Maybe not. Anybody? No? Anybody?
I really appreciate everybody's patience because it's been a long evening, so thank you.
Well, thank you, friends, for coming out.